Oh, hello my dear friends. As you no doubt already know, I am Lord Harold Tillingsworth III, the Dean of the History Department at Cambridge University. And for the next 20 minutes, you and I will actually have something in common. We will both be watching the third installment of the Arab-Israeli conflict on my favourite YouTube channel, The Most Intriguing Military Battles. Thank you, Lord Tillingsworth. I think that you've done enough damage for today. I'll take it from here. Welcome back, friends. I am still Amelia, and we are still investigating the Arab-Israeli wars. Today, we will begin our exploration of my favorite engagement of this special topic, the SixDay War. This episode is dedicated to the events preceding that conflict, specifically the Suez Crisis and the Great Escalation. We will tackle the actual conflict of June of 1967 in the next episode. While the military actions of this engagement did last for only 6 days, the behind-the-scenes warfare in political corridors began a decade earlier. This was the war that so many, on both sides of the conflict, demanded, while silently hoping that it would never materialize. This is the story of a brilliant military conquest, extraordinary audacity, political intrigue, and gross incompetence. This war is also the sad story of two brilliant, and from all I have read, very decent men. The Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol. And so, one should not expect a hero versus villain type of Disney story here. Both of these great men operated under immense pressure, and both died prematurely, within 6 months of each other, just 2 years after the end of the War of 1967, crushed by the impossible weight of the decisions they had to make. Let's not waste any time, and pick up where we left off last episode. The year was 1948. Please see our previous episodes to learn more about the Palestinian Civil War, as well as the War of Independence. After the Israeli victory of 1947-48, a state of uneasy peace existed between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Though it only lasted for 7 years, this period brought massive changes to almost all Arab countries involved in the War of Independence. After being disillusioned with the monarchy, a group of Egyptian officers overthrew King Farouk under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser. By all accounts, he was incorruptible, patriotic, and lived his life without excesses. Most remarkably, he truly seemed to be motivated by the greater good of all Egyptians, as well as Arab people at large. In his efforts to make Egypt great again, Nasser realized that he needed to completely revolutionize the army, and for that, he needed weapons. And lots of them. The British were still deeply unhappy with Nasser for kicking them out of Egypt, while the French were massively displeased with him for his open support of the Algerian independence movement. So, neither France nor Britain were willing to cooperate, and the US had too many preconditions for Nasser's taste. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was willing to provide the Egyptian army with modern weapons and minimal strings attached. Nasser did like those AK-47s. According to the logic of the Cold War, there was no middle ground. And in the eyes of the Americans, Nasser went to the dark side, with all the expected consequences. The US still hoped, however, that they could deploy their most powerful weapon, neatly stacked dollar bills, by offering to pay 1/3 of the costs associated with the construction of one of the most grandiose projects of the time, the Aswan Dam. The financing came with preconditions. Nasser had to stop buying Soviet weapons and become a loyal buyer of American military hardware. Nasser refused, and by mid-July of 1956, President Eisenhower realized that the bromance between the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and Nasser was unlikely to end anytime soon. And so, he withdrew the US support for the Aswan project, with no prior warning to the Egyptian government. Taking it rather personally, Nasser wasted no time and, in retaliation, nationalized the Suez Canal, diverting its revenues to pay for the dam. Legally, he had every right to do so, as long as Egypt paid a fair compensation to the shareholders of the canal, of which Britain was the largest. And since Nasser liked to put on a good show, the nationalization of the Suez Canal was to be no exception. He wanted to shock the entire world, and for that, he needed to be the first one to inform them of this event. That meant that he needed to take over all of the key positions and offices of the canal administration just minutes before his grand announcement to maintain the element of surprise. He selected a few dozen trusted men, headed by his old friend Mahmoud Yunus, and told them to wait for his signal. Once again, mystery was in the air, as the signal was not just a simple phone call, but a code word hidden in Nasser's speech that he was delivering on the evening of July 26th in Alexandria. Upon hearing the code word, Nasser's troops jumped into action, capturing all the major offices within 30 minutes, which gave Nasser the much-desired opportunity to be the first one to shock the world with the news that the canal was now in Egyptian hands. Britain did not like it a bit, and neither did France. They approached Israel to participate in a tripart attack on Egypt, with the IDF providing ground forces on the Sinai Peninsula. On October 29th of 1956, Israel indeed attacked Egypt. Britain and France delivered a fake ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt to cease all hostilities immediately. Since Israel had no desire to withdraw, the Western powers were given a chance to intervene under a highly questionable pretense. This cooperation between Israel and the Western powers had proven to be deeply unpopular, not only in the Arab world, but equally in the US and the USSR, with both sides applying pressure to end what has since become known as the Suez Crisis.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance.
In fact, the opposite happened, with the invasion bringing Egyptian society together in support of Nasser. In time-honored British tradition, Eden, while proclaiming his undying love for Egyptian people, was bombing Egyptian cities.
I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love.
His second mistake was to assume that Khrushchev was too busy killing Imre Nagy and other Hungarian comrades who supported the anti-Moscow revolution to intervene on Nasser's behalf. Lastly, and the most consequential error, was Eden's assumption that Eisenhower would support Britain. Being wrong on all three accounts cost Eden his premiership. Despite a very successful campaign from a military viewpoint, politically, the Suez affair had proven disastrous for both Western powers, as well as Israel. After a massive pressure from Eisenhower, Britain and France had to withdraw. By December, Israeli troops on the Sinai were replaced with a UN peacekeeping force. The Suez Crisis solidified the Arabs' hatred against both former colonial powers, as well as Israel. This crisis had, however, one powerful silver lining for the state of Israel. Even before the Suez Crisis, the French were not very popular in the Arab world, due to the brutal war France was waging against the Algerian independence movement. As a result of this deepening rift with Arab countries, the French turned decisively towards Israel. This partnership could very well be the single most important factor responsible for the subsequent military successes of the Israeli Air Force in 1967. French-made Mirages and Mystères were about the only planes that could hold their own against the Soviet MiGs. And pretty much the only planes that Israel was able to obtain at the time. In 1956, Nasser may have lost militarily, but he gained unprecedented support and admiration across the Arab world. Israel had every reason to worry. Despite his reliably bellicose anti-Israeli language, I believe that Nasser never wanted to engage in an all-out offensive action against Israel. He fell victim to his own immense popularity, to inter-Arab rivalry, and to political struggles in the Soviet Union. While French and British paratroopers were pounding Egyptian positions in October of 1956, Soviet tanks equally brazenly rolled over the Hungarian uprising, making it clear that the Warsaw Pact membership was not a voluntary affiliation. In the process, Soviet leadership found themselves deeply divided between the old-fashioned Stalinist hardliners and more progressive communist leaders. This divide deepened even further during the Cuban Missile Crisis almost exactly 6 years later, in October of 1962. While the world was saved from a nuclear war, Khrushchev was seen as weak, since he compromised with Americans. This contributed to his downfall. Although, I still think that his, at times, crazy behavior in the international arena, such as the infamous shoe-pounding incident, also helped this process. As a compromise between the more modern and conservative elements within the Communist Party, Khrushchev was effectively replaced by a partnership of Premier Alexei Kosygin, the most moderate in this collective leadership arrangement, and First Secretary of the Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev. Behind Brezhnev, who represented a more conservative wing, stood the army and security apparatus, as well as Stalinist ideologues such as Mikhail Suslov. At the risk of oversimplification, a more conservative wing was itching for a proxy fight with the US, encouraging Egypt to take bolder steps in the Middle East, supplying Nasser with weapons, instructors, and promises of support. Thus, as Nasser assumed unprecedented heights of popularity by the early 60s, he was playing the role of the grand Arab leader, while getting Egypt involved in a messy and unwinnable war in Yemen, draining scarce economic resources of Egypt, and weakening the country's economy and military. Nasser needed the next big win, and he needed it fast. With Soviet arms enhancing both Egyptian and Syrian armies, many in the Arab world felt that now was the time to finish off the Zionist entity, as Israel was referred to by its less-than-warm neighbors. In the spring of 1967, Israel had experienced an increasing number of Palestinian infiltrators that were trained and subsidized by Syria. The tensions between the two countries rose to the point where both put their armed forces on high alert. Israel downed 6 Syrian MiGs, and the entire region was put on war footing. All that was necessary to start the fire was for someone to produce a spark. As tensions heated up, Egypt sent a delegation to Moscow to sound out a potential response from the USSR in case war was to break out. From what I have gathered, the Egyptian delegation was given 2 conflicting messages. The first one, by Premier Kosygin, was consistent with the general Soviet line, advising Egypt to exercise caution and not to attack first. The second one was from Soviet Defense Minister Grechko, as well as other intelligence officials, who had passed Egyptians a Soviet intelligence report, which was absolutely false, suggesting that the IDF was amassing a force on the Syrian border, getting ready to strike. While the information was not confirmed by Egyptian intelligence, the Egyptian army was also itching for war with Israel, in part to avenge their military defeat of 1956. The Egyptian military was commanded by Nasser's college friend, Minister of Defense and the first Vice President, Abdel Hakim Amr, While many people within the Egyptian leadership were responsible for the devastating defeat that Egypt suffered during the Six-Day War, Amir bears a disproportionate share of the blame, due to his hunger for power combined with military incompetence. He continued to provide Nasser with exaggerated reports of the army's preparedness for war, while creating a near-total information blockade regarding anything related to military matters. Amir received Soviet intelligence with enthusiasm, as it gave him yet another reason to demand a more aggressive stance towards Israel. Nasser, on the other hand, was greatly troubled that if Syria were to enter the war before Egypt did, he would lose the initiative that came with the territory of being the ultimate Arab leader. Thus, he needed to regain the initiative and show the world that he, and not Syria, could lead the Arabs to destroy Israel and avenge the Palestinian al-Nakba, or disaster, of 1948. Thus, neither of the two Egyptian leaders were terribly interested in conducting a thorough investigation of the Soviet intelligence report of IDF War Preparation. Nasser was convinced that by simply creating a military escalation on the Sinai Peninsula, he would put enough pressure on Israel to show that he controls the situation.
Do you think the Israelis are going to attack the Arabs? Well, we are waiting for them. We left for them the initiative completely. We are waiting for them.
The main problem was that in an effort to make Egypt's military buildup very public, Nasser compromised military security, and the friendly folks from the Israeli military intelligence services were among the most faithful viewers of these broadcasts, taking note of every little detail, counting every armored car that went onto the Sinai Peninsula. In general, the IDF intelligence gathering was second to none, an asset that really became handy during the first minutes of the Six-Day War. But more on that later. After requesting from the UN General Secretary U Thant the removal of all UN forces from the Sinai, remember, these forces had been stationed in Sinai as a result of the post-Suez settlement agreement, Nasser suddenly found that nothing stood in between him and Israel. While in Israel, the Prime Minister Eshkol was severely criticized for his indecisiveness, I believe that he too wished to avoid the war, expecting that a military defeat of Arab armies was an invitation for yet another war, while the defeat of Israel would spell out the imminent death of the state. But as Egypt got more aggressive, so did the criticism of Eshkol at home. Stuck between the rock and the hard place, Eshkol was desperately hoping that Lyndon Johnson would be his political reinsurer against the Soviet intervention on the Egyptian side, something that he feared most. And since good old Levi was born and raised in the territory of the Russian Empire, presently Ukraine, he knew well what to expect from the Soviet army in Israel. While Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, tried to persuade the US administration to commit to Israeli defense in case of Soviet intervention, Eshkol knew that Johnson had no political means to offer such direct support, as the US was mired in Vietnam, and there was no way in heck that Congress would authorize yet another war. Thus, Eshkol waited and hoped for a diplomatic solution, trying to enlist British, French, and Americans to support Israeli efforts, with no success. In the meantime, the Israeli population began losing their composure, seeing the massive buildup of Egyptian forces on the border with Israel. The Israeli military was not pleased with this waiting game either, fearing that every day that passed made their enemies stronger. After Nasser closed the Straits of Aqaba to Israeli vessels, thus cutting off the southern route from the port of Elad, Israeli society lost its cool, forcing Eshkol to give up his post as Minister of Defense, while retaining his position as the Prime Minister. The legendary General Moshe Dayan was appointed as Minister of Defense, finally tipping the scale within the Israeli government in favor of those who advocated for an immediate preemptive strike against Egypt. And so, in the morning of June 5th of 1967, Israel launched an extremely well-prepared and thought-out military campaign, which became known as the SixDay War. Please click on the link in the description below to watch the second part of the SixDay War episode, as well as other videos in our special series on the Arab-Israeli Wars. And as always, thank you for commenting, liking, subscribing, and watching the most intriguing military battles. Marvelous as always, Amelia. Please, click on the link in the description below to watch the second part of the SixDay War episode, as well as other videos in our special series on the Arab-Israeli Wars. And, as always, thank you for commenting, liking, subscribing, and watching the most intriguing military battles.